All right, so the result of all of this collusion by the railroads and price fixing and basically picking on the little man, and all this overexpansion in railroads does end up causing problems here in this country. And so the major result of this not only is the Panic of 1877 from overexpansion in railroads, but by the 1890s, we're going to see these railroads basically expanding to the point and competing with each other to the point that a lot of them end up failing. And so in the Panic of 1893, one of the major causes is that a fourth of all the major railroad companies in the country go out of business, and they go bankrupt. Now, to stabilize the railroad and the economy, J.P. Morgan, the financier, and Vanderbilt, who was the major railroad baron, end up basically buying out a lot of other railroad companies. You see, after 1893, this period here of company consolidation and decrease in competition. They stabilized the rates and decreased the debts of these companies basically by buying out all the smaller companies. Now, this is bad for a lot of these farmers because now you see fewer railroads competing for more of a share of the market. So farmers are going to be hurt even further, which is why you see the populist movement gaining speed, particularly here as we move closer to the 1896 election. By 1900, 7 companies end up controlling 2/3 of the railroads across the nation. And they're going to do this by creating what are called interlocking directorates. Basically, interlocking directorates are where there are a bunch of supposed privately owned railroad companies that are basically being run by the same board of trustees. So you have the same people running a whole bunch of companies, so these are one giant monopoly. So these basically create 7 regional monopolies of the railroad industry. And this is going to cause more and more demand, especially by people in the Midwest, for more regulation of the railroads. And so the problem with this, though, is that because the government largely has a laissez-faire practice in their economy, a lot of this early regulation is going to be pretty ineffective. For example, in the 1870s, you're going to see a lot of the Grangers in the Midwest who end up passing what are called Granger laws in the 1870s, which basically provide their local state governments the ability to regulate these railroad rates. The problem with this is that in 1877, there's a court case called Munn versus Illinois, which basically declares these Granger laws to be unconstitutional. It's followed up by Congress basically listening to a lot of these complaints and passing the Interstate Commerce Act in 1886. The problem with this is that it's largely ineffective until the Interstate Commerce Commission is created in 1903. So you're going to see a lot of efforts here to try to kind of sort of regulate the railroads, but they're going to be largely ineffective because they just don't have the teeth, they don't have the tools to be able to enforce any of these things. And eventually we're also going to see the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which tries to outlaw any kind of business practice that restricts trade. This was aimed at trying to regulate the railroads, but the problem with this is that, again, there's no power of enforcement, and so it's going to be largely ineffective, and eventually replaced by the Clayton Antitrust Act during the Progressive period. So you're going to see railroad regulation being largely ineffective at all. We also are going to see the rise in the steel industry, and this has started in the 1850s with the creation of the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process is a cheaper, more cost-effective, more efficient way of creating steel in which iron is melted down, impurities are skimmed off, and you're left with a harder, stronger, lighter metal, in other words, steel, in response to this, which is going to replace a lot of these iron railroad tracks and a lot of construction. The robber baron that you need to know in conjunction with this is Andrew Carnegie, who becomes the #1 steel baron in the country by the 1870s and bases his businesses here out of Pittsburgh, thus the Pittsburgh Steelers. And his form of business consolidation is going to be called vertical integration. And vertical integration is when a business owns all parts of production from start to finish. So in other words, in this case, Carnegie, he owned the iron and coal mines that he needed for his raw materials. He owned the railroads necessary to bring these products to his industrial center in Pittsburgh, basically where his steel mills were. He owned the steel mills, and then he owned the steamships necessary to take his product and transport it to market wherever that market may be in the world. And he is going to make tons and tons of money off of this. He ultimately ends up selling his company to J.P. Morgan in 1900 for $400 million, basically making him one of the richest men in America at this point in time. J.P. Morgan ends up basically combining Carnegie Steel with a number of other steel companies that he buys, and he creates an even larger, even more powerful steel company known as U.S. Steel, which becomes the first real billion-dollar company in American history. Now, Carnegie ends up taking his money, and he really becomes famous because he is going to be one of the first real philanthropists in American history. Now, remember, a philanthropist is somebody who uses their money to try to help out other people. And so Carnegie really lays out his philosophy in a book he writes called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he basically argues how it's the responsibility of the rich to use their money to give back to help the rest of society. And to try to provide more of these opportunities for others. And so he's going to end up spending most of his fortune by building things such as Carnegie Mellon University. He builds the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh. He builds Carnegie Hall. He builds a whole number of these philanthropic organizations in order to basically try to do good off of this. But he's also going to be heavily criticized for really crushing any kind of labor movements and for treating his workers very, very badly throughout this period. Another one of these industries that you all need to know about is the oil industry. And it really starts to take off here in this country after 1859, when a guy named Edwin Drake discovers the first real oil wells in the United States in Oiltown, Pennsylvania, thus appropriately named. And by 1881, you're going to start to see oil becoming more and more important here in the United States. And the robber baron you need to know in conjunction with this is John D. Rockefeller, who ends up creating his own type of monopoly called a horizontal integrated trust known as Standard Oil. Now what this means is that the business owner owns all of one part of production. So in other words, in Rockefeller's case, he owned 99% of all the oil refineries in the United States. So he didn't own the oil wells or the oil drilling companies, but if you wanted to take your crude oil and turn it into something useful, such as gasoline or heating oil, his trust ends up basically controlling all these other smaller oil refining companies through what he called the Board of Trustees, where you would have this board, but then he was the chairman of the board. He basically ended up controlling all these other companies through this way. So again, he owns all of one part of production. All of these different trusts, either vertical integration such as Carnegie or horizontal integration such as Rockefeller, the result here is that these large trusts, these large monopolies, end up basically being able to snuff out any kind of competition. And during this period, because you have laissez-faire government policy, you basically are going to end up seeing these industries creating their own trusts. So we have the sugar trust, we end up with tobacco trust, we have the leather trust, we have the fruit trust, we have all these different companies that are basically going to be monopolizing their portion of the market, which eventually leads us here to the antitrust movement. And so starting in the 1880s, for the first time, we're going to see people complaining about this laissez-faire idea. And they really felt, especially the middle class, really feared that businesses that were unchecked and unregulated by the government would end up basically snuffing at the power of anybody else and harming the consumer in the end. And so in 1890, the first antitrust law, which was the Sherman Antitrust Act, ends up being passed by Congress, which prohibited what they called anything that combined a business in a combination or a trust or any kind of conspiracy that restricted trade. The problem with this is the wording really was way too vague in this, and they didn't have the teeth in order to enforce it. And ultimately, in 1895, all the power behind this law ends up being taken down by a court case called U.S. versus E.C. Knight. And E.C. Knight was the sugar trust located in New Jersey. And in this court case, they basically ruled that Sherman could only apply to trade, but not to manufacturing. And so the only people that the Sherman Trust Act was actually ever applied to successfully were labor unions.